So one thing with the weapons is there going to be like some sort of risk reward weapon? Because you think of something like the is it the upgraded ray gun where if you shoot it too close to your feet, you just might die. Um,
Yes.
yeah. Are you going to have anything like that where it's like really powerful, but if you are stupid with it, you will just ruin your run?
Yeah, so there's definitely lots of different weapon stats that we're able to
Mhm,
play with the systems that have been made now. So, like a blowback stat, for example,
mhm.
you shoot within a certain range, you inflict damage on yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
We're definitely looking into how we can have our range of weapons really be diverse.
Mhm.
And of course, as well, our artifact weapons, which are much more demonic in nature, which, you can look at like your wonder weapons, for example. But yeah, we're doing our own stuff with that, which will hopefully introduce some even more cooler mechanics on top of what
Mhm.
other games may offer.
I don't know if you want to say this yet, but with your main hand weapon, are you always thinking of it to be some sort of gun? Obviously, there's a crossbow as well, but is the plan to always keep it in that sort of gun sphere, or are there ideas of things outside of just doing guns?
So right now we've got your sort of weapons in one side of your combat system, but now we've actually added in the ability to aim down sight.
Mhm.
And then you sort of got abilities on your other hand, but now we've been working on a system that allows you to sort of like put away the guns and your other hand and sort of go into an alternate state, if you will.
Right.
So, like putting your gun down and then sort of like bringing out two swords, for example, or um, what else can I say? There's a couple things you should probably leave to the release window. But
Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, we are planning on having stuff that replaces what's in your hands to again like reinforce alternate combat styles and like spicing up moment to moment sort of gameplay.
Hmm. Well, okay, balance is obviously a thing that's very. I don't know how you feel about balance, because balance. Some people want their game to be where every weapon is viable. Sometimes you want it to be where there's something where it is a clear upgrade path where, by the time you're in round 30, the basic weapons are just not going to be viable anymore. But like what are your thoughts on this?
So balancing games is obviously super important. We've got two designers that, towards the end of a project's life cycle, their job is to make sure things are balanced to
Mhm,
what we're sort of trying to go for. But in terms of like balancing all things evenly, it's definitely with a game like this, it's not actually something you want to do.
mhm.
I think for us, like you've played the demo with the crossbow.
Yeah.
The crossbow basically becomes completely useless by round five,
Mhm,
deliberately so pushes players to go find another weapon. But then if you get to the upgrade mechanics, the blood infuser, that upgraded crossbow becomes incredibly powerful to
mhm,
to reinvigorate that and allow it to be used again at higher rounds. Again, with the weapons, like we sort of said before, their damage sort of scales as you upgrade them. But your ability damage works differently. So there's multiple different parts of balancing with that sort of stuff
mhm,
where you know weapons will get really good and then fall off until you re-upgrade them. But then when you hit the max tier, it's all about how your abilities can really, or your weapons support your abilities, if you
mhm,
will.
mhm.
Flipping that sort of on its head, where you might consider abilities to be your support things, it's actually more of like your ability is the thing that deals the most damage at higher rounds with Blood Reaver.
Okay, so early on, you don't really have that much access to your
Mm,
abilities because you don't have that many enemies to kill.
yeah,
So it's mainly about the weapon damage. But then as you go further, the weapons are balanced around the content when they should be found. And then
yes, absolutely.
as you go further, the weapons start to fall off and the abilities start to become your main focus, with the weapons being there more to support building up your abilities so you can do the heavy damage.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. So it's like you almost flip the stakes from the early round to the mid rounds to the sort of later rounds as well, which we paid a lot of attention to. I could show you the spreadsheets that went into actually balancing those things to make that happen. And Jackson is an absolute genius when it came to that sort of stuff.
Mhm. I think that's really cool because it might not be immediately evident when a player is trying it, but I feel like they'll get the idea after they start messing around with their abilities and see, like, okay, well, this does a lot of damage here. Well, okay, now it's doing less damage. Like, it's not gonna. Maybe they'll have to go through a couple of runs to work out, like, when that swap really starts to make sense. And obviously, it'll be like a gradual thing as you go through the rounds. It'll be more heavily leaning on the abilities. It wouldn't be like a hard, okay, now ability time.
Hmm.
But I do think that adds some definitely some interesting change to the typical formula you see here.
Yeah, and that's what we really have tried to do, like including stuff about our combat style that separates us from those other games to make people like understand the core mechanics from other games, but then actually interacting with them, especially as they play more and more, it's like, oh, I need to change my playstyle
Mm-hmm.
to accommodate for the systems in Blood Reaver as opposed to just playing the game like you would another wave shooter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and there was definitely a deliberate decision around that.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. I'm curious to see how that would feel at the higher rounds then.
Hmm.
I'm yeah, maybe how much of the higher round stuff is there in the current demo that's available?
So the game sort of just goes infinitely with the current
I
demo.
mean,
So
like as content. At what point is content no longer being added? Like, at what point have you found all the demons that are going to be added into it?
So in the demo right now, there's the two demons. The second
Oh,
one
okay.
appears at round 5, and once you've unlocked the whole sort of space of the map and done the 3 rituals around the map, which you can do by sort of round 10, that is effectively what you could call like you've seen all the content.
Right.
But it is playable for as long as you can survive for.
Mhm.
Yeah, and with the sort of ritual system that we've got in the game that lets you unlock the blood infuser, it's almost like pushing you to do those early on to make them easy for yourself because two of those rituals take place in really small spaces. Doing them at later rounds when demons have hundreds and hundreds of health means that they get super difficult.
Mhm.
But yeah, content sort of you stop seeing new stuff necessarily around round 10, but we're trying to push that further and further back with the new versions of the game, especially when you start including Easter eggs, which might take 20, 30 rounds to do, especially on a first try sort of thing.
Mhm. So when everything is ready, like, is there like a point that is decided right now for like where the end of the map should be roughly placed?
In terms of when you exfiltrate, we're sort of like working on, I guess, balancing those numbers. Like, I think we've been discussing recently on being like, it shouldn't even appear till round 25, for example, or, it appears at that round and then there's a window that you can use it, then it appears again at a later window. That's all stuff that we'll be working on over a
Mhm.
longer period of time. I can't really give really an answer there, but in terms of like replayability, I think with the way that the sort of abilities are now constructed, somebody could have an entirely different experience with the ability system and the weapon system each time they sort of play,
Mhm.
based on how they build their sort of character.
So, are there discussions internally about how difficulty difficulty scale difficulty scaling should work? Like, is it supposed to be a linear line of difficulty upwards? Is it supposed to be okay? It's a fairly flat difficulty. Hey, you get to round 5, spikes up a bit, then spikes up, and like 5, 10 rounds later, and spikes up. Like, what's the intended goal here?
So with difficulty, it is intentionally quite curated.
Mhm.
So like we sort of said, you've got that sort of linear difficulty to around round 5, and then it really spikes. And we do that at certain points to really sort of push people to get better, and almost like you have that point, the separator points we like to call them, where
Mhm.
you might place and relax, I guess, for a few rounds from rounds 18 to maybe 21, but then 22 is like, oh, things have got much harder, and there's that distinct sort of step
Mhm. Mhm.
up until a point, of course, and then it just becomes exponential um, with that, because you want to make a system that goes on forever,
Mhm.
but curating for the first 50, 60, 70 rounds, I think is something that we have been doing already.
Mhm. How long does a round go for? And then how long would it take to get to like round 30 or so? Assuming that you're doing things in a relatively
Mhm.
not, perfectly optimal, but playing at a pace that you sort of intend things to be done.
I would imagine so. It's all based on, so each round has a certain amount of demons
Right.
that are in it, and that increases each round. So the more demons that spawn, the more you have to kill, and their health also increases over time too.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I imagine to get to round 30, at a semi-optimal level, you're probably playing for around an hour, maybe an hour and a half.
Mhm.
Realistically, it could be longer, it could be less, depending on how you're sort of going about upgrading and doing the rituals and whatnot.
Because that's always a concern I think about with roguelike games, where something like Hades has it fairly well tuned, where even if you're not that great at the game, like a full run takes 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes if you're a bit slower. Then there are some other games, where, like Dead Cells, where it might take like 40, 45 minutes. And with a game, it can start to get fairly tiring, especially if you are dying in the later rounds. If the systems take too long to get back up to the later rounds, especially if in this case there are things that you want to do at the later rounds, like maybe you have that exfiltration there, maybe you have story elements that can't be done to those later rounds. So I do think it is worth definitely considering how long you intend for things to take, because if it's too long, you get to a point where hardly anyone's going to want to get to that point, because like, okay, well, you don't want people to start feeling like it's become a drag and they've exhausted the content and just want it to be over.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you. It's definitely a hard balancing act to know when to, excuse me, gate the player from certain things. And I think with like Easter eggs and narrative and all that stuff, I think our philosophy is that you can do it or you can start to do it from round one. But realistically, just of like how those things progress, it might take you all around the map. Those things take time to sort of unlock. And yeah, like naturally, we're sort of aiming for a certain point or round point or time limit where you should, if you're trying to do an Easter egg, it should take you. Again, I don't have the exact numbers for those things, but we are definitely looking into how we can make sure that those goals are achievable within a reasonable amount of time. But then,
Right.
looking at some other games, you might have Easter eggs that take an hour, or if you're doing them for the first time, it might take 3 hours because you've got to go back and find different steps that you had no idea existed. In terms of discovery, though, like if you were a player that knew exactly what you're doing, 45 minutes to an hour realistically could be a time frame that we looked at. Again, no promises there. It might be longer if that's what people want, and that's what we discover.